Hello and welcome to the Hidden History series. In this episode we will discuss the maps of Tartaria. Great Tartaria was collectively founded in 458 BC. It wasn't until 1586 the civilization of Tartaria or Tartary was politically and spiritually founded, and the griffin flag of the Tartarian emperor and the owl flag of Great Tartaria were officially designed. Over 300 years later, the cultural unity of Great Tartaria had steadily fragmented in northern Russia, western China, and throughout its colonies in mainland Europe, Canada, the United States, South America, Central Asia, and elsewhere. The civilization of Great Tartaria would continue to exist until 1894. After 1922, the remnants of Great Tartaria were made into separate republics, such as Tatarstan, which is now part of the Russian Federation. The landmass of Great Tartaria once extended across northern Asia, where the civilization bordered Siberia. Over the span of at least 400 years, many of the Nordic Tartarians had constructed the white cities of Molgom, Bayada, Kambulak and Barga in northern Tartaria. Additionally, much of the extensive Piasida region and Jakutski region of northern Tartaria became highly productive agricultural locations where fruits, vegetables and cereal crops were planted and harvested on the farmland. Many white cities were constructed. Enormous ornately designed palaces, the ornately designed light temples and divine temples, castles and stately homes sparkled in the daylight and brightly shone during the nighttime, and were able to harness the etheric electricity to power their buildings. Great Tartaria became a golden empire that influenced many buildings in mainland Europe, Canada, the United States, South America, Central Asia and elsewhere on the planet. The Italian merchant from northeastern Italy known as Marco Polo travelled into China and elsewhere on the Asian continent in 1292. He actually produced the first map of Great Tartaria. Marco Polo travelled along the Silk Road between 1271 to 1295 and then arrived back in northeastern Italy. This means he would evidently have seen the vast buildings of Great Tartaria during his travels across Eastern Asia and Central Asia. The manuscript that recorded the adventurous travels of Marco Polo is called the Book of the Marvels of the World, written in 1302. It was actually written by the Italian romance novelist called Rustichello Calazio. The book was named The Million, which was the name Marco Polo used to describe his pursuits. But in the English language, the manuscript was called The Travels of Marco Polo. The document was originally called Book of Wonders of the World, or Devisement du Monde, Enjoyment of the World. On the 20th of June 1493, the physician, humanist and cartographer from Western Germany called Hartmann Skedel produced a map of Great Tartaria. His map was printed in his book called Chronicle of the World, 1493, the complete and annotated Nuremberg Chronicle. After the first mud flood reached its most destructive stage in 1740 due to the Great Frost and many other climatic changes around the planet, many of the maps began to change. Bringing it up to present day, over 10 years ago, on the 15th of January 2013, President Putin inaugurated the Cartography archive with the Russian Geographical Society and Russian Academy of Sciences, where maps of Tartaria were made widely available to the Russian people. Was the Russian Federation embarking on a cultural process of revealing its true history? Vladimir Putin is most certainly aware that a country that does not know its history cannot have an effective and cohesive spiritual future. During the 1st of February 2017, Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev met with the former president of Tatarstan, who had become the state councillor of the Republic of Tatarstan, Mintamashimi, to present him with a map of Tartarus. The map had been made by the Dutch cartographer William Bleur. So how did William Bleur know how to draw and outline the contours of Tartaria if the landmass never existed? Also on the 22nd of July 1998, the CIA declassified a document called National Cultural Development under Communism, which they had produced on the 1st of June 1957. A section within the document mentions the existence of the Tartar civilization and how its once incredible presence had to be censored and deleted. Here is the quote from the document that summarizes how any knowledge about Tartaria had to be kept from the public. In other words, Tartar history was to be rewritten. Let us be frank, was to be falsified in order to eliminate references to the Great Russian aggressions and to hide facts of the real center of Tartar-Russian relations. Here is a list of maps starting from 1493 of Great Tartaria. Chronicle of the World 1493, the complete and annotated Nuremberg Chronicle by Hartmann Skedel, published on the 20th of June 1493. Great Tartaria by Abraham Ortelius, published on the 23rd of April 1572. His map appeared in his book called Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, or The World Theatre. A Newy Map of Tartary by John Edward Speed, published on the 14th of March 1626. Tartary, or The Empire of Great Cham by William Jansen Bleur, published on the 18th of April 1627. Le Grande Tartary, or The Great Tartary by Nicholas Sanson d'Abbeville, published on the 31st of January 1652. Great Tartaria by Frederick de Witt, published on the 12th of September 1665. Le Grande Tartary, or The Great Tartary, Russia, Russland, Tartary, Siberia, Asia, Carte, Map, Carte, by Nicholas Sanson d'Abbeville, published on the 30th of April 1680. A New Description of Great Tartary, the Great Mughal Empire of Japan and China by Frederick de Witt, around 1680. Grand Tartary, or Great Tartary by Alain Manasson Mallet, published on the 15th of December 1683. New Map of Great Tartary by Alex Hubert Jaliot, published on the 17th of February 1690. Copperplate Map Great Tartary by Francisco Wasimoet de Afferden, published on the 30th of September 1696. The Great Tartary by Pieter van der A, published on the 18th of October 1713. The Great Tartary, according to new observations by Pieter van der A, published on the 31st of January 1714. New Map of Great Tartary, or The Empire of the Great Cham by Henry Abraham Chatelain, published on the 16th of March 1715. The Great Tartary, following the new observations of Messiers of the Royal Academy of Sciences by Pierre Vander, published on the 30th of September 1715. New Map of Great Tartary, or The Empire of Cham by Henry Abraham Chatelain, published on the 15th of October 1719. 10th particular sheet of Chinese Tartary containing the country of Kiechin, the mouth of Saghalien Ula in the Eastern Sea, and the large island which is within, volume 6, by John Baptiste d'Anville, published on the 30th of April 1735. 7th sheet of Chinese Tartary, which contains the greater part of the country occupied by the Khalkha Tartars, by Jean-Baptiste d'Anville, published on the 30th of April 1736. Table of the Empire of Russia and Tartary Universal, both Greater and Asiatic and Lesser and European, with unknown ways, contains partings. Mostly by Johann Matthias Hesse, published on the 15th of January 1739. Map of the Great Tartary, established upon the accounts of several travellers from various nations and several observations made in that country by Johannes Covins, Guillemard Tillis, Cornel Mortier, published on the 30th of September 1757. Great Tartary and the Islands of Japan by Louise Brian de la Tour and Louise Charles Desnos, published on the 28th of February 1766. Chart of the Russian Empire and the Tartars, or Map of the Russian Empire and Great Tartary by Franz Ludwig Gusfeld, published on the 31st of January 1786. Great Tartary and Chinese Tartary by William Rowland Faden, published in 1798. La Grande Tartary by Adrien Hubert Bru, published on the 30th of September 1806. Western Tartary and Eastern Tartary. The map of Great Tartaria was printed in the manuscript called A Map of the World from the Best Authorities by John Morris Vallance and James Welford Thackeray, published on the 13th of June 1814. Great Tartaria was printed in the document called Russia in Asia and Tartary by Henry Warren Teasdale, published on the 16th of December 1852. These are just some of the maps that have been created, but there are so many more. It was around 1850 and the start of the Industrial Age, Great Tartaria started to disappear from the maps. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and you can also join the member section for extra content. We also have our book, Vanished Kingdoms, which explains what happened to the Tartarian Empire. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.